Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Bharat Tota. I'm a partner with Kearney's Advanced Analytics practice. We'd like to thank you for joining us in this session focused on how analytics investments are paying off. This is based on our latest Advanced Analytics Impact Index study. We plan to cover three topics broadly. First one on how to capitalize on growing amount of data we all have access to. Second, which areas within data and analytics we should focus and invest in. And third, how to go beyond the buzz of artificial intelligence and use it to drive real change. We'll hear from our guest speaker, Professor Raed Ghani of Carnegie Mellon University, and opening remarks from our Analytics Impact Index co-author, Professor Ujjwal Kayande, Director at Center of Business Analytics at Melbourne Business School. Couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you'll be muted during the webinar. For questions, we'll be collecting them through the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. So feel free to ask your questions as we go along the session, and we'll do our best to answer your questions along the way. We'll also have 15 minutes for additional questions at the end of the webinar to also hear Professor Ghani's responses. And as a follow-up, we'll be sending a link to the recording of the session, and additional information regarding the upcoming 2021 Advanced Analytics Impact Index study will be sent on to your registered email addresses. We'd like to begin with a couple of poll questions to get some views from the audience today. You'll see the poll questions pop up on your right-hand side of your screen, and you have 30 seconds to submit your responses. Operator, can you please launch the first poll? So as you can see on the first poll, our expectations have been set on data and analytics, that it can solve the unsolvable. And if you have to place your bets, where will you place your bet that analytics will have the highest impact in the next 5 to 10 years? Your choices are ensuring availability of natural resources for future generations. Second choice is enabling driverless cars. Third one is eradicating bias in the society and enabling social equality in accessing resources. And the last one is sending humans to Mars. Let's wait for a few seconds and we'll try to get the poll results. It's interesting that most of you have picked driverless cars. I would have put my bets on the third one, which is the need of the hour. The next poll, operator, can you launch it? I think we all realize that data and analytics need to be at the core of business decisions. In your mind, what's the biggest obstacle that you think organizations face from becoming a data and analytics driven business? Your choices are leadership, culture, talent, technology, and budget. Great. Very less responses on talent and technology, most responses on culture. Very much in line with what we see based on our experiences working with clients across different industries and with varied levels of maturity. I would put them into three buckets: mindset, skill set, and tool set. I put them in that order because tool set is probably the easiest one to solve, followed by skill set, and mindset is the toughest one. With that, I would now like to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Raed Ghani. Professor Ghani works at the intersection of machine learning, data science, public policy, and social good. Previously, he was chief scientist of the Obama 2012 election campaign, where he focused on data analytics and technology to target voters, donors, and volunteers. Professor, over to you.
So yeah, thanks for having me here, and thanks everyone for coming. I thought what we could do is, we sort of heard about the survey and the report, and I think what we could do is sort of bring things down to a little bit lower, more concrete level, and start by sharing with you some examples from kind of my experiences over the last several years working in all of these buzzwords, right? So one of the reasons I have all these buzzwords up here is because that's really what they are. They're all just buzzwords. They all mean the same thing, except if you talk to different people, they might give you slightly different definitions of, well, this is AI and this is data science and this is just analytics and this is what used to be business intelligence. And But this one is machine learning. In practical terms, people on the ground, who are working on these types of things, all of those distinctions are mostly meaningless, right? They're typically going to be sort of thrown at you, typically by vendors or trying to sell you a new technology, because they've already sold you data science. They can't sell that to you again, so they're going to now sell you machine learning. And if already machine learning has been sold, then they're going to sell you AI. But for practical purposes, and again, most of you are trying to solve real world business problems. What matters is, how do we use data to make better decisions? Like, that's kind of the bottom line for all of these underlying technologies is, and as we talked about right earlier, is some of it is technology, a lot of it is, culture and leadership. And so I'm going to kind of give you a few examples from areas where you may not have typically worked on. So a lot of my work, I spend a lot of time in the business world, and then as Bharat mentioned, took a detour and worked some in politics in the Obama campaign, and then over the last sort of 8 years or so, have been working with governments and nonprofits on, again, helping them use a lot of these types of technologies to sort of to tackle social challenges. So I'm going to give you some examples from my work to kind of illustrate and kind of talk about things that that may not be kind of the big hyped up examples of the use of these types of things. So we'll start with some work we've been doing in Kansas over the last actually 5 years. And so the criminal justice system in the US is pretty broken. It's not unique to the US, but one of the things that is pretty bad here is the numbers that you see on the left here. The top numbers are depressing because a large number of people in the US go through the jails. So these are just jails and don't include prisons, right? So if you add prisons, it's even bigger. But 11 million people go through the jail system in a given year. Lots of money is spent there, but the depressing pieces are also at the bottom, which is 2/3 of them have mental health issues, substance abuse disorders. And so what ends up happening is somebody goes into jail, they come out, they have needs that are not met. They need mental health services, they need other health support. They don't get them in the jail. So when they get out, those things cause them to go back in, and they just keep cycling through over and over again. And so the work that we've been doing in a few places, and this one specifically is Kansas, was they came to us and said, well, we've got a high rate of people who are going back to jail, and we would like to reduce that rate because we want to help people. Jail is not the place to put them. They need mental health support. And so they wanted to allocate resources for mental health outreach. And what they wanted us to do is sort of help them figure out, who should we target, who should we prioritize for those services, with the goal of reducing recidivism. They could give, if you and the initial plan was to sort of give this out to they would be able to create resources for a few hundred people every month to go and do this outreach and provide them these services. And the question was, how do we figure out who to allocate them to? How do we figure out if it's working for them? And how do we figure out sort of how to then scale? Right. So the first thing we did was, in any project, right, you're trying to figure out, what is it that we know about these people? How would we sort of get this data? And in this case, it wasn't sort of one company that had all this data, right? The criminal justice agency had some data about criminal justice behaviors. The mental health agency had data about who had come and received mental health services. But some of the early data on sort of criminal justice comes from the police department, where somebody's being arrested. There is data about the same people from 911 emergency calls, because a lot of the times these people end up using a lot of emergency services. So the idea was to, again, combine all of this information. Step one. Step two was to figure out, well, who do we prioritize for this outreach, right? And we wanted to do two things. One, people who are high risk of recidivism, going back to jail. Two, who have mental health needs. So we then built a machine learning model to take all this data and predict who's going to be at risk of going back to jail. Now, if this was a typical sort of analytics machine learning project, you would stop right here. Hey, and we evaluated, and we found, we could accurately predict all the people, or a large number of people, who were going to go back to jail. Now we would stop and watch these people go back to jail. Right? That's not useful to anyone. The machine learning part is done, and we can say it's accurate, but it's totally useless for reducing recidivism. So step three was, which we started about a year and a half ago, um, was a randomized trial where we then took this predictive model and used it to allocate resources to measure the incremental impact of these interventions. So the idea was not to test two things. One was to see, do these interventions, do this mental health outreach program, reduce the recidivism rate of the people that they are applied to? But second is, do they have different types of impact on different types of people? So it could be that on average, we reduce recidivism by 20%, which is great. But on certain people, we reduce it by 40%. Other people, we actually hurt them because we're calculating this average. We want to know more precisely if there are certain groups that we're doing well on, certain groups we're not, so that we can design new programs for those people. So that trial has now been running for about a year and a half. It's supposed to finish in June, in a couple of months. And so we're going to get final data back. But early results, we're finding that the overall recidivism rate is going down as a result of this. And we're finding that the most impact we're having is on the highest risk people, which is for us really encouraging because it allows us to kind of focus all our efforts on the people who are most at risk of going back to jail. So the whole idea was really, the step one was really trying to figure out, what is the overall goal? What are the actions, interventions do we have? And really focusing on that to then go on combining all the data together, the usual data integration stuff we do, building these machine learning predictive models to identify high risk people, and then designing these trials to not just test the how accurate these systems are, but how much do they allow us to reduce the risk and to improve the outcomes, and then go back and that. So that's kind of one example. Here's a different example, but a very similar process, right? So this is lead poisoning. A lot of you who are, familiar with lead poisoning, it's either because you have kids or because you've heard about Flint, Michigan. Lead poisoning is a bigger issue. It's in a lot of older cities where, pretty much every home built before 1977 in the US has lead paint. And as paint gets old, paint chips, and kids, when they start crawling, they pick up lead dust, and horrible things happen. The worst thing is that all of these effects are irreversible. Once you're exposed to lead, there's nothing you can do to fix it. So most of the time, the way our governments deal with it is they test kids for lead. And when they find somebody who's positive, who has high levels of lead, they then start trying to figure out, how do we remove that lead? How do we test for it? Except once you've been tested positive, it's too late for you. So this is work with City of Chicago. They came to us and said, look, we know we're being reactive. We're waiting until it's too late because we can't fix every home proactively. Can you help us figure out which homes to prioritize to do lead inspections before a child gets lead poisoning, so we can actually prevent it from happening rather than be reactive? So again, the same process, trying to understand what data we have, what do we know about these kids. So we took data from all the blood tests that were done over the last 10 years for lead, all the home inspections, all the data around, the condition, the home assessment, the condition when it was rehabbed, what kind of material, all those different things, and use that to build a system that predicts risk of each child that's in Chicago somewhere between birth and sort of the 1 or 2 months, because typically kids get lead poisoning about 9, 10, 11 months old when they start crawling. So what we wanted to do was to identify the risk early enough that gives the health department time to, one, inspect for lead issues, but also get them fixed. So that means a few months, they need a few months in the middle, right? So if we predicted at month 8 somebody's going to be at risk, there's not enough time to actually intervene and fix something. So the idea was here to predict at 1 month, 2 months, 3 months old, the kids who are going to be high risk, so that the health department is able to go in and intervene early, check for hazard remediation. So that, again, we ran a trial, and then now that system is deployed in the city health department. That's being used to both allocate resources, but also working with hospital systems to give them the same thing into their EHR, electronic health record system, so that when a pregnant woman comes in for a checkup, the system flags and says, well, the kid that's going to be born in the next few months will be high risk of lead poisoning given you the address and everything else. So now it's able to kind of help the city get even earlier than birth to do some of these interventions. Another example, another problem that unfortunately we are more, more and more familiar with, which is police misconduct and police reform, right? And it's been an issue for a long time. So this project that we've been doing, which is again started about initially around 2014 actually, was work with a few departments to help them build a system that's able to identify police officers who are at risk of doing these types of things: unjustified use of force, unnecessary in any shootings, injuries, basically any kind of misconduct that we want to prevent having. And it turns out that, most people don't know this, and I didn't know it until I started working in this area, is most large police departments have a system already that's called an early intervention system that's supposed to flag police officers that are at risk of doing these types of things. Except nobody had bothered to evaluate if it actually worked at all. So they had bought it, customized it, configured it, installed it, and it was running, and nobody had bothered to see whether it worked or not. Basically, it turned out when we dug deeper, those were very simple rule-based systems, right? They were sort of built on a handful of, in this case, if somebody has had 4 uses of force in the last 90 days, raise a flag. If somebody has more than 3 complaints in the last 2 months, raise a flag. If somebody has taken more than 2 weeks of sick leave in the last 3 months, raise a flag. That was literally the entire system. And so we started working with the first department we worked with was Charlotte Mecklenburg in North Carolina. We just evaluated their existing system, and it turned out it was flagging more than half of the police officers in the department. So already making it useless, nobody trusted it. But while it was flagging more than half the people, it was still only getting about slightly higher than half of the people who were going to go on to do one of these things. So essentially, it was a random system that they had spent a lot of time and money buying, and that wasn't just them. That's kind of the standard system that was being used in most police departments. So we worked with them to get, again, all the data about the officers, their training, their dispatch, their internal affairs, their investigations, their arrests, their stops, combine all of that to generate a system that would predict high risk of, and again, an officer doing one of these things, and then provide that information to the internal affairs team and their supervisors so they could figure out what can they do to reduce that risk. Again, we can predict and watch them do something horrible, or we can sort of try to figure out how to reduce it. And there were sort of different factors. Like some of them were really factors around their historical behavior, but some of them more interesting and nuanced. Like we found things like if they were repeatedly sent on dispatches involving domestic abuse cases, especially involving kids, or dispatches involving suicide attempts, that put them temporarily at high risk of doing one of these things in the near future. And those are kind of, stress indicators, right? Where you can sort of think about giving them a cool down period, not sending them on another one of these if they've been on one recently. The Charlotte Police Department also hired a counseling team to kind of, there was training, there was kind of cooling down period that was taking them off the duty, all the different interventions. And the idea really was sort of embedding all of this into their workflow so that the risk scores get generated, potential reasons for that risk score get generated, they get put into this workflow so that the supervisor gets to see them, and now they have to assign an intervention and monitor that intervention over time to see if it's reducing their risk of being involved. So it wasn't just about building this machine learning system, it was embedding them into the workflow of how these investigations were handled and how they were being tracked and monitored over time. So now that system is deployed in a few different places, and we're sort of getting some of that data back to evaluate. Right. Another example, very different example from some work we did a few years ago in Syracuse, New York. Right? Small place, but it was around water pipes breaking, and they sort of came, when a water pipe breaks, it sort of yes, it's annoying, but it also causes, water supply goes down to a lot of, residential areas, but also a lot of grocery stores can't sell refrigerated things because they have to shut all of that down. And they're expensive to fix. And so it turns out, in this small town, Syracuse, New York, they get about a break every other day, right? So 180 breaks a year. So they came to us and asking for help. And the reason I bring out this example is, unlike some of the other problems where we predict something is bad is going to happen and try to avoid it, here, if we predicted that a pipe was going to break, the intervention or the action wasn't necessarily dig up the street and fix it, because that might be too expensive. The pipe might not be, might not break over the next 3 months or 2 months. What they wanted to do was use these risk scores to coordinate with the roadworks, the public works department, to figure out a plan to coordinate across the street. If this road was already on schedule to be repaired or redone in the next 6 months, push that up forward if it's a high risk pipe in there. If it's a medium risk pipe, instead of digging it up, can we dig up a small area, and then they put in sensors in there to monitor it, because it wasn't worth to replace it, but it was worth prioritizing monitoring a little bit more and spending a little bit more money. So that's a different type of action to take in response, where the high risk ones might be to push up repairs earlier, the medium risk might be to monitor more carefully. That's not just go and fix something. So that's kind of an interesting approach to doing a lot of these maintenance type issues that some of you might be working on. One last example I give is, this is some work in Jakarta in Indonesia, where they have a few thousand traffic deaths every year. Right? Traffic is bad, but also traffic is resulting in a lot of fatal accidents. One of the things they did, like a lot of we hear about smart cities do, is they just tackle that problem. They put in a bunch of sensors, because sensors reduce accidents. And so they put in a few thousand cameras. And then a couple of years after that, they came back and said, well, we have these cameras which have now recorded, several thousand cameras have recorded several couple of years of videos, and we have no clue what to do with it. And what they were struggling with, which a lot of us, a lot of organizations do, is they have the capacity to analyze data, but when the data is not in a database or a spreadsheet with rows and columns, they don't quite know what to do. So in this case, what they really wanted was not a system to predict an accident, but they really wanted to understand what were the root causes of these accidents and what should they change to reduce these accidents. So they wanted to know things like, oh, whenever these pedestrians are coming to traffic in these areas, that's causing the traffic to change, and that's causing an accident. Or whenever a car goes the wrong way in this area at this time, it results in the future with these types of accidents. Or when there's an overloaded motorcycle, that might be causing something. Or a food cart vendor coming in the middle of the street. What they wanted to do was sort of get a structured stream of these events over time, tagged with what the event is and where it happened and when it happened, so they could then sort of see what's happening nearby. The challenge was when we sort of what we had to do was basically, one was there's a lot of this type of systems that exist to detect objects in computer vision and all these image recognition things, except they're all designed for sort of most of the US type of traffic, right? There's no concept of food cart vendor or overloaded motorcycle. If you can apply some of these things to the buses in London, they don't work because the buses are very different. So we have to kind of figure out, how do we customize these to a very different type of data, and kind of detect things like objects, cars, motorcycles, rickshaws, people walking, which direction are they moving in? If they're moving, where are they moving? On the street, on the sidewalk, in the middle? And we sort of found things like, here's kind of what the end result was, right? We're finding sort of flagging areas like this, where this is a two-way street, right? But there are cars coming regularly. And what ends up happening is that downstream from there, it causes accidents. And so if we repeatedly find these things automatically and say, look, here's what's sort of resulting in things, then here the solution might be to put a median in the middle of the street over there to stop that from happening, so that you prevent downstream accidents, right? So those are kind of, some examples from kind of areas that where, again, there's a very clear kind of, in our cases, a social or a policy goal, to reduce certain things. And the idea is like, how do we actually structure our systems to help support that? And one of the things you would have noticed and across all of us who are working with any type of human behavior things, right? Whether it's trying to reduce police misconduct, where are we doing that? We're trying to understand what types, what are the characteristics of police officers who end up being involved in these types of incidents? Can we predict who's going to be involved in the future? And then can we influence them to change their outcomes? Same for the jail example I gave is, we're trying to understand what's happened in the past. We're then trying to use that information to predict high risk people who have certain needs. And then we're trying to allocate those interventions to people so as to influence and measure and keep going, right? That's the same as a lot of marketing challenges that a lot of you probably work on, right? Where you're trying to influence consumer behavior, or in the case of you're working on problems like fraud detection, where the goal is not just to detect fraud today, but to reduce and deter people from doing these things in the future. And so that's one framework to think about when we're dealing with human-related analytics problems is all three are important components. You have to do all three in order to really tackle a problem, because it's not enough to understand. It's not enough to predict. And influencing people without understanding and predicting is not, if you don't focus on who you're trying to influence, then it's not efficient. And so you kind of have to balance all of these things. And so what I want to jump into now is based on kind of, some of these examples and a lot of other work we've done, there are kind of certain lessons I want to kind of go over that at least I've learned, and how to effectively use all the buzzwords I talked about, right? To actually have impact, not to build sort of little things or not to get sort of press releases, really actually have real impact, right? And I think the biggest one, which is going to be obvious to a lot of you if you've done this, is, there was a time when we had sort of these 10-year data warehousing plans, right? Where you would sort of go and say, we're going to redo our data warehouse over the next 5 years. And then by the time those 5 years were over, the technology had completely changed and what you had built was totally obsolete. So then you would start again, and then you would do the same thing, right? What we're doing now in sort of a lot of these analytics type things is that, we really can't build something over 5 years because things change a lot. And we need kind of, we need sort of more small iterative things where you show success, you improve, you get better, and not massive new efforts that go on without any intermediate results. So I think it's critical also to get buy-in. You want to show intermediate results, and I think what a lot of projects do is to sort of go into these phases, right? We're going to define and scope the project, and then we're going to collect data, and then we're going to clean data, and then we'll do some analysis, and then by the time 4 years have gone by and we have zero ROIs, the question is, could you, to just give you an idea of all of the projects I'm talking about, the first iteration of these was on average a few months, and even if they lasted 5 years, it was very iterative, where the first iteration was, what can we show in 3 months that allows us to move forward and make a case for going the second level and the third level and the fourth level. And so here's sort of the second pieces, right? It's often you sort of we talk about, we want to be data driven, and we want to sort of analyze data. And the most common form of that actually I see is people building dashboards because we have data. Well, the obvious thing to do is to build a dashboard. So I'm actually curious, Bharat, can you launch the poll? I'm curious, how have people here on the call sort of found dashboards useful? Let's see if people gave honest answers, or because they might be worried that their bosses might be looking over their shoulders. Wow. Okay. So half of you think that they were actually useful. I am shocked. I have yet never seen a dashboard that actually drove any actual action. So I always make fun of dashboards because dashboards are the perfect example of I have some data, let me make some pretty pictures. And so most of my experiences have been, number two and number three. The best use has been, well, they're great. I can show them to people. And number three has been about really people are asking for reports. If you just build a dashboard, you don't have to send it to them. They can just go and look at it themselves. The only times, and this means that you guys are doing hopefully something right, is that in my mind, any analysis you're doing, it has to inform an action. If it's not informing an action, people will just sort of admire that that analysis, but nothing will actually change, right? And that means that you're not going to be able to sustain that effort and actually get something out of it. And so the key is to kind of figure out like what are the actions. And so when I'm working on these projects, I'm really starting with what we can talk about the data and the analytics and everything else, but I want to start with what actions do you have? Because the goal of this analysis, in my mind, the way I look at it is you've got some business goal, you've got some actions that exist, right? And then you have data and analysis. But what analysis is really doing, all the machine learning and AI, it's basically connecting the data that you have to the actions that you have to achieve your business goals. Right? That's kind of the whole point of data analytics of any sort it's a bridge between your data and your actions. And you can build many of those bridges. The bridge that you're going to build is the one that most likely achieves your business goals. And so if you don't have actions, then it's kind of pointless to do a lot of these analysis. Your analysis might be to figure out what actions you should take or to create those actions, but it's sort of it's a lot of the times I get organizations that will come in and say, we have all this data, can you help us analyze it? And so we become kind of data centric rather than problem centric, and that often sort of leads to zero impact. The other one is, we all, again, if you're on this webinar, you care about metrics, right? We're all driven by metrics. The problem is not that we don't have metrics. The problem is often that we don't have the right metrics. And so I'll give you an example from my politics days. One of the, all political campaigns use a lot of social media, right? So one of the metrics that people really cared about with social media was how many followers did we have? And at that point, I think like Barack Obama had whatever 20, 30 million followers on Facebook, let's say, and some large number on, and that was a metric that people were really concerned about. Like we should increase the number of followers. Except that was the absolutely wrong metric, because when you actually look at the number of people from each followers from each country, the top city was actually Jakarta, and London and Milan were in the top 10. Right? None of those have electoral votes, as far as, at least for now. So zero number of votes. And so the metrics often that we end up measuring are the ones that are easiest to measure rather than the ones that are the ones that actually impact, right? In this case, incremental number of electoral votes. Even if you think of politics, right? If you often ask, like, well, what are you measuring? Well, number of votes. Well, no, who cares about number of votes? It's about the probability of winning. Right? People have gotten more votes in elections and lost the election. So just because so it's kind of important not just to be metrics driven, because it's very easy to count the number of things you've done. It's more about coming up with the right impact metrics that actually, if you increase those numbers, your chances of in politics winning, or in business, achieving your goals sort of goes up, right? Here's another one, right? And I think this is something that, again, there's an obvious sort of lesson here, like, yeah, you should test what you build. And all of you will probably claim, yeah, we test everything we build, right? But testing is not the same as running experiments. And so before you actually deploy something, you have to have an idea of, is it better than how we're doing things today? Because that's sort of the business case you're creating is, today, here's what we're doing. If we put this forward, we're going to be able to do it better. And so what experiments are is really not just trying something out, but really understanding more rigorously and scientifically what's the lift that you're getting, right? It's not just trying something. Often we think we sort of, we equate experiments to trying something out. Like, oh, it was an experiment. Like, okay, if it was an experiment, what were you trying to learn from it? So again, I'll go back to, because it's those stories are now, old enough and funnier. I'll go back to my, again, politics example. During the 2012 elections, one thing came out, I think it was the website Orbitz, right? The travel website. They put out a study that says, hey, we found that Mac users spend more money on plane tickets. Like they buy more expensive tickets. So somebody in our campaign got really excited and said, hey, we're gonna test something. We're gonna test what if we ask for donations? We ask if somebody's coming in from a Mac, we ask them for more money. So they ran that test. They came back really even more excited, saying, guess what? They gave more money. So now we should keep asking, Mac users for more money. And my question was, did you also ask other people for more money? Oh, no. Well, let's do that. So they came back and ran that experiment, and found everybody gave more money. And so what the lesson here is really that, like experiments means that you have to kind of deliberately design for what is your control group? What are you testing? How do you randomize that? And how do you test it? Because what comes out of that is something you can actually use to generalize and scale rather than just run a one-off thing. So it's important to kind of design things before you deploy and scale in a way that shows you both lift, because that gives you the ROI, but then also kind of design it in a way that's actually tested. Another point here about sort of, again, a lot of the tools that are being developed today, somebody will come to you and say, hey, we have this really amazing new algorithm. We don't quite understand or explain how it works, but trust us, it is much, much, much better than the last one. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it, but you should be careful. For certain applications, it might be too risky to use something that doesn't quite explain what it does. For high risk, high stakes situations, if you're doing things around sort of healthcare, that might be a little bit risky. But if you're doing sort of things around sort of more targeted ads and you're putting out millions of ads every second, it may not matter because you can test out some of these things. So you kind of have to be careful around these types of black box algorithms. That being said, there's a lot of more research that's been happening the last couple of years on explaining what some of these methods are doing. So if you end up using some of these, just be conscious that there are other methods that exist, tools that exist that might be a little bit more white box, that might be worth sort of digging a little deeper into, because it's too risky. Right now it's risky because you don't really know what's happening, but they're going to get more and more risky as regulations come around the use of a lot of these types of tools. Another piece that I spend a lot of time on is looking at sort of bias and fairness in these types of machine learning and AI algorithms. Actually, I'm curious, like what, can you put up a poll? I'm curious how people are how people here are thinking about sort of bias in AI and machine learning algorithms. Has that come up in your organization or industry? Is that something that's important or too early to think about? Okay, so wait, is there an answer D? Not sure. No answer. Okay, so most people have fallen asleep or they don't care. And I think this is sort of a good reflection, right? If you're right now in the public policy government world, it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And if you're in financial services, it's been an issue for a long time. But if you're in some of the other industries, you're not quite sure how it's going to impact you. It's becoming an issue because a lot of agencies are thinking about how do we look at regulating governance of these types of tools? What are the things we have to put together? So I do a lot of the projects that I work on, the goal is not just to build the most efficient system, because often what happens is if you're looking at, you have limited resources, you want to help as many people as possible. But when you use limited resources to help as many people as possible, you help people who are cheapest to help, which means you leave people behind who are more expensive or harder to help. And that leads to inequities, right? So in a setting where you are a government agency, you have to care about, you should and have to care about equity, not just efficiency. And a lot of these tools that exist off the shelf, they're really focusing on efficiency. Um, and so the question is, how do you test, how do you design your systems to also be equitable? And how do you even figure out what that means? Like, so for example, a very, things that have come up recently that have been, that's not kind of in the criminal justice and issues are things in like the hiring space. Companies that are helping recruiters, take Indeed and Career Builder and other companies like that, where if you're getting a set of 1,000 applicants and you're shortlisting those 1,000 to 100 to send to a recruiter as these are the people who are most qualified for the job you just posted, well, you're using them, the way they're building the machine learning systems to predict who's more qualified is by looking at historical data. So if you've never hired a woman for this job before or a Black person for this job before, the machine learning systems are not going to magically decide that this person is qualified. All they're doing is replicating what you have done in the past, just doing it more efficiently. So if you care about efficiency, that system works really well. If you care about actual effectiveness or fairness, that system is going to be a disaster. So the question is, how do you build systems like that are fair and equitable? How do you audit? So we have a bunch of tools that we've built that audit for the fairness and bias of our systems. But then also, how do you decide on these trade-offs? And a lot of these projects that I just talked about are sort of doing exactly that. Is they're not designed to be just efficient, they're designed to be equitable. And that's something that more and more is going to be becoming an issue, both from a social perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective, that you'll have to figure out how to deal with these things. And today's analytics tools off the shelf don't do that. So that's something you have to be careful about. So the last, one of the last pieces is, and we're running out of time, so I'm going to just quickly go over this. Right, you guys have already probably spent time looking at these types of things around, yes, your analytics have to be embedded into your workflow, but your people also have to be, you have to kind of, often this decision happens on, do you have a centralized team, or do each department kind of gets their own analytics team, and then, how do you navigate that? And the question really is that, you kind of have to figure out how to balance that. Both on the tool side, it has to be embedded in the workflow. Like the example I was giving from the police department, yes, there was a lot of the analytics work, but then a key part was how does it fit into your workflow, and how do you people take action on it and close that loop, right? The This part is sort of important, right? Is sometimes we become over reliant on data, even if the data is not good and the data is not enough. And so we kind of have to know how to know the limits of your data, when not to trust the data. And right now, if you're thinking about sort of, I'm sure the most common thing everybody's thinking about is COVID, whether it's cases or vaccines or lockdowns or all these different things. One thing that's really challenging is a lot of data that we get around COVID, for example, it's not accurate. The case rates are based on who was tested, right? And that doesn't mean it's an objective ground truth. Same for things around sort of, hospitalizations. There might be a lag in the hospitalization data. Same for that's been really common, but one of the things that's happened over the last year is a lot of government agencies they've been using it historically, but they've also more recently started using unemployment data more regularly to figure out what's the economic condition of a county or a state. But unemployment data is not real time. And it's not about the entire economy. It's about the formal job sector. There are a lot of people who don't file unemployment because they don't have unemployment insurance and they don't appear in that data. So a lot of the times, decisions that we're trying to make about certain regions, same for a lot of the COVID policy research has been using mobility data from sort of cell phone providers who can track where people are going. Well, that depends on has tracking on their cell phones, has smartphones. So you might be making the wrong decision if you notice that if you're already relying on mobility data and that's biased towards, younger, more whiter populations, your policy decisions are going to be impacted, right? So it's important to kind of understand what are the biases and limitations of the data that you had in terms of is it timely, is it accurate, does it have right coverage, and then the decision you're making on using that data have to sort of take those into account. Right. And I'm going to sort of end with um, I'm going to skip the poll here. Is we have way too many vendors and tools out there, right? And a new tool comes up every day, and somebody's trying to sell us some of these tools, and just because there's a new thing that exists doesn't mean it makes sense from a business perspective, and it makes sense from a technical perspective. And so it's very easy to kind of get distracted by shiny objects. Not that they're not useful. There are new tools that come in that are useful in many cases. The question is, do they fit into your overall strategy? Do they help you take an action better? Do they help you improve the outcomes that you care about? That's sort of, those are the important pieces, right? That the tools in them are useful, but they're only as useful as kind of how they fit into your overall strategy and overall ability to do something with them. Right? Building again a new tool that's a shinier dashboard isn't going to change the actions you're taking unless you've kind of designed it for that. So it's kind of important to keep that in mind. And so that's kind of mostly what I had. I think this is just kind of to end with is, given all of this, how do you actually get started in one of these things? You want to identify what are your actual goals that you're trying to achieve? What are the actions that you have? What do you need to achieve them, right? You need a team. And that's something that a lot of organizations are struggling with right now, because you might be sort of hiring for a data scientist and nobody knows what a data scientist is, because it's sort of a vague, ill-defined role. And you might need engineers and product managers and actual, R&D people versus people who analysts and then the data infrastructure you need. But then when you sort of start doing it, right, it's sort of this loop of you want to prototype something quickly, but you want to make sure that you actually test it. But you don't want to get stuck in this prototyping and testing loop. You want to be able to figure out, okay, how do I deploy? But once it's deployed, it's not done. Things will change, the world will change, the data will change. So you're going to have to kind of how to figure out, maintain and monitoring this. And then most importantly, it's going to be about what we started with is the poll of what's the problem? It's the leadership and the culture. And that's about change management. It's not about the technology. Is how do you convince people to actually, how do you build these things so that people use them, and how do you develop a culture and leadership so that they're more open to using these things that are newer, that are different than what they're used to. And that's a whole other piece that you have to kind of think through. So I know we went to a bunch of things here, but I'm happy to, I'll stop now, but I'm happy to take questions, and feel free to, ask questions now, but also happy to, answer things over email later. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gunny, for sharing those examples and learnings coming out of those projects, specifically around avoiding that pilot purgatory that you've talked about. We do have some questions from the audience. The first one is, what are ways to compare the value of a new AI solution to existing traditional processes it is intended to replace?
Yeah, so I think that question often, if you had a way of evaluating your existing process, it would be really easy to test this new one. But often we don't have. I'll give you an example that most of you don't think about, right? So this is, but because I deal with that world a lot, I was having a conversation, meeting with a bunch of attorneys general from different counties and states, and they were really worried about sort of AI having, adding biases to the criminal justice system, and how do we know that they're doing the right thing? And I asked them, how often do you evaluate your judges, and what are the metrics? And they said, oh, we don't. So there's nobody evaluating a judge in how, that's the current business process. Judges are making decisions. So let's take simple decisions around, let's say, give somebody bail or bail. Now, if you gave somebody bail, the decision is correct if they were able to, if they came back for their bail hearing, didn't commit a crime, didn't run away. The decision is wrong if they committed a crime or didn't come back. If you didn't give somebody bail, you kept them in jail, you don't know if that was right or wrong because they didn't have the opportunity to not come back. They didn't have a choice. And so in that case, the system isn't set up for measuring the status quo. And so when you add machine learning and AI to it, you have to figure out, how do I evaluate this? And I think that's the same problem in a lot of business cases, business situations, that we don't have good mechanisms for testing. If you do, then you basically run them in peril, right? Then that's what a pilot would be, is running them in peril before you actually go switch over. And you measure the lift. And if that lift is sort of the value you're getting, then you measure the cost. What would be the cost is in building the system, but also in having a team and maintaining the system. So there's sort of this, there's some cost to building this and maintaining this new thing. There's some lift that you got from your comparing, not to perfection, but comparing to the status quo. And that's the choice you have to make, is this cost worth this lift? It could be in dollar amounts, it could be in other types of impact metrics that you care about. But that's the methodology, kind of what you would typically follow.
Thanks, Professor. The next question is an interesting one. How do you coach younger analytics talent coming straight out of school to shift their mindset from being more theoretical and trying to be more practical?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think there are a few different answers to that, right? One answer is to influence people who are training them to get and be part of that training. Because the more, so I'm at Carnegie Mellon, right? We're training our students, and we're always trying to figure out, how do we train our students better to be ready for the real world. And that means partnering with organizations in the real world. So all the projects I talked about, students are involved in all of those projects. They're not just students, but students are part of all of these. So I think the way you do it is you influence the curriculum, you partner with academic institutions, give them, and that might be sometimes uncomfortable, because that partnering sometimes means just sort of, giving problems, but the real partnering means that you're actually giving them access to data, and that's access to sensitive data. And all of this, again, these examples I gave, we have, highly confidential data. It's stored in secure infrastructure. It's only accessible to specific students. But when these students work on these problems and graduate, they're so much more useful and effective than somebody who's just kind of worked on toy things, right? So I'd say the best way to do it is to influence people like us and say, here are the big problems we're facing. Can you help expose your students to that? And we'll partner with you to not just expose them, but also train them, because it's both better for the students, it's good for the universities because they're training, and then it's good for those of you out there who are looking to hire more people.
Great. Thank you, Professor. And in the interest of time, there's a bunch of other questions from the audience, and we'll try to answer them offline directly with you. And we would like to thank you for joining us in this session. And please look forward to a note from us on the upcoming Analytics Impact Index study. And you all have a good day.
Thanks. It's good to be here.